Good evening, dreamers. Curious about forgotten stories. ASMR history brings a soothing past. Relax now. Let us begin. The Price of a Whisper, a medieval assassin's tale. Let's start with a figure you think you know, a shadow steeped in myth and cloaked in cool, deadly confidence. The first lie crumbles the moment you step into his world, not on the moonlit tiles of a palace roof, but in the filth of a forgotten alley. The contract wasn't slid across a polished table in a grand hall. It was a damp coin purse pressed into a starving man's hand, with a whispered name that was a death sentence, either for the target or for him. The man who accepted it was no master of a hidden art, no member of an ancient brotherhood. He was a ghost long before he took the job, a disgraced soldier whose name had been erased from muster rolls, a man whose only remaining skill was the grim ability to endure. This wasn't a career path. It was the final stop on a train that had derailed so spectacularly that all other tracks had been washed away. He was a desperate peasant, an ex-thief with steady hands, or a man so far off society's radar, he could kill another human being and still not merit a line in the census. Think about that for a second. The system didn't just fail him. It didn't even see him. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title land or even a goat to your name, you were in management. But for this man who had just escaped the gnawing misery of a debtor's prison, whose reputation was built on solving problems others wouldn't touch, and whose presence in a tavern could go unnoticed for hours, this damp purse was the only ladder out of the pit. The name whispered in his ear was not that of a quiet turnip farmer. It was a corrupt baron with a fortress, a bishop with too much gold, or a merchant with 12 bodyguards and a moat. The targets were always insulated, always powerful, always surrounded by layers of steel and loyalty bought with coin. The pay was tempting, a brief flicker of hope in a life of darkness, but the job itself was horrifying. By the time a man like him considered it, he had nothing left to lose. No family to protect, no future to build, and certainly no dental plan. The job came with no pension, no glory, and no evenings off. He couldn't hang a shingle that read, "Quiet eliminations by appointment." His entire existence was now predicated on staying quiet, moving fast, and never ever telling anyone what he did for a living. If asked at an inn over a mug of watered-down ale, he was a traveling carpet seller. The stains on his clothes just dye. He didn't dream of this life. He landed in it because the world had chewed him up and spat him out, leaving him clad in a hood and clutching a rusty dagger. He wasn't the hero. He wasn't even the villain. He was a footnote that made everyone nervous, a tool destined to be discarded, unlikely to ever truly enjoy the coin he bled for. His training began the moment he accepted the purse, and it was a brutal, silent education. The first myth to burst wide open is that of the hidden monastery, the wise mentor, the inspirational flute music, playing as he practices in the candlelight. There was no montage. There was no teacher. There was no pep talk. If he learned anything, it was by not dying the first few times he tried. His first unofficial kill long before this contract wasn't for politics or power. It was over a stolen loaf of bread in a city he couldn't even name. The man he fought was another starving soul just as desperate. There was no artistry to it, just a clumsy, panicked scuffle in the mud, ending with a rock to the temple. He had thrown up afterward, his body shaking, not with the thrill of victory, but with the sickening realization of what he had become. That was his graduation. That was his diploma. Survival was his only teacher, and its lessons were written in scars. He was a desperate amateur, armed with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb a wall without sneezing. His military experience was a distant, bitter memory, but it meant he knew at least how to hold a knife without cutting himself. Stabbing someone is a grimly intuitive act. Escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact, however, takes skill or luck. It was usually just luck. There were no manuals to study, no guild orientation meetings to attend, no safety briefings on the hazards of the trade. He wasn't taught how to spot a body double or which window nobles preferred for their late-night exits. He figured it out while hanging from a stone sill, the rough rock scraping his fingers raw, listening to the guards patrol, and praying he hadn't just crept into the servants' quarters again. His education was a tapestry of near misses and cold sweats. He learned the specific creak of a floorboard by almost stepping on it, freezing in the dark with his heart in his throat. He learned the patrol patterns of the guards by watching for days from a stinking ditch, memorizing the rhythm of their boredom, and the exact moment the oldest one, the one with the wheezing cough, needed a breather. His arsenal was not one of high-tech gadgetry. There were no retractable wrist blades, no smoke bombs, no enchanted daggers that returned to his hand. His toolkit consisted of whatever he could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath his tattered cloak without clanking. Before this mission, he spent an afternoon preparing. He stole a heavy wool robe from a washing line, not because it was black and mysterious, but because it was thick enough to hide the shape of his body and the few tools he carried. He found his dagger in the ribs of a dead city guard after a tavern brawl, its edge nicked and stained. He spent an hour sharpening it on a loose paving stone, the grating sound setting his teeth on edge. This blade was his best friend, his boss, and his only retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no tinkering with gear between missions. He didn't polish his kit. He prayed it wouldn't betray him mid-strike. Poison was another tool, but it was a desperate gamble, a matter of trial and error, with a heavy emphasis on error. He didn't have access to purified cyanide. He had plants' minerals and toad guts gathered from the forest floor, or bought from a shifty herbalist who asked no questions. It was a game of guesswork. A pinch too little, and the target might just get mildly dizzy and more suspicious of his soup. A pinch too much, and the assassin himself might die from exposure before the first course was even served. There was no medieval poison control hotline, only hope and a strong stomach. If he was exceptionally fortunate, he might have picked up a few tricks from the thieves or mercenaries he occasionally crossed paths with. Perhaps an older, more seasoned killer, seeing a flicker of his own desperate youth, might show him how to walk on cobblestones without making a sound. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and invariably short-lived because old assassins don't retire. They simply disappear. His education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Only bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping, chilling realization that he was utterly and completely on his own. The infiltration of the Baron's castle was the final exam in this grim curriculum. For 3 nights, he lay in a damp haystack just beyond the outer wall, the scratch of fleas a constant torment. His world narrowed to the stone fortress that loomed against the bruised twilight sky. He wasn't a cool-headed master of stealth. He was a bundle of gnawing fear and gnawing hunger. Every shout from the ramparts sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Every bark of a dog made his heart hammer against his ribs. His disguise was not a custom-tailored cloak of shadows, but the simple, filthy rags of a peasant, a costume that allowed him to blend into the misery that surrounded the castle, but made him an object of immediate suspicion within its walls. He was invisible to the nobles, but to the other servants, he was an anomaly, a new face in a closed system, where everyone knew everyone else's business. He had spent 2 of the few coins from his advance to bribe a scullery maid, a girl whose fear of the Baron outweighed her fear of being caught. The information was simple, a loose grate over a drainage ditch that emptied just inside the kitchen courtyard. Getting through it was a suffocating ordeal, a journey through mud and filth that left him smelling like a sewer, the stench clinging to him like a second skin. Once inside, the paranoia intensified. He wasn't just fighting guards with swords, he was fighting gossip. Every servant was a potential alarm bell. The cook who gave him a suspicious glance, the stable boy who saw him lingering too long in the shadows, the chambermaid who didn't recognize his face. Any one of them could whisper to the guard captain faster than he could say, "I'm just the new herbalist." He moved through the castle's underbelly, like a rat sticking to the servant passages, his hand never far from the rusty dagger hidden in his belt. At one point, hiding in a dark alcove as a pair of guards passed a small child, no older than 5, toddled out from a nearby room. It was the Baron's youngest daughter. She didn't scream. She just stood there staring at the strange, dirty man, huddled in the shadows, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity. For a heart-stopping moment, the assassin froze his mind, screaming. The child pointed a tiny finger at him. Before she could make a sound, a nursemaid bustled out, scolded her for wandering off, and scooped her up, never even glancing into the darkness. The assassin sagged against the wall, his legs weak with relief, and a profound, unexpected wave of self-loathing. The target was a man who lived in a state of perpetual fear himself. The Baron was paranoid, and rightfully so. He was surrounded by backstabbers' relatives with claims to his title, and dozens of people pretending to like him. He didn't eat without a food taster. He didn't sleep without 3 heavy locks on his door. He even rotated his sleeping chambers, a deadly version of musical chairs. The assassin's moment came on the 3rd night. The scullery maid had confirmed the Baron's location, her trembling hand taking the last of the promised coins. The peak of his tension arrived as he stood outside the bedchamber door. This was it, the culmination of days of terror and discomfort. He slipped the lock with a thin piece of sharpened wire, his breath held so tight his lungs burned. The room was dark-smelling of stale wine and sweat. The Baron was a heavy, snoring shape in the massive bed. This was not the time for an elegant, clean blade in the dark. As he crept forward, a floorboard one he hadn't accounted for groaned under his weight. The Baron awoke with a startled grunt. The struggle was not a choreographed dance of death. It was a messy, panicked, and brutally intimate affair. It was the desperate strength of a man with nothing to lose against the flailing terror of a man who had everything. There were no witty one-liners, only grunts, the tearing of fabric, the sickening scrape of bone, and the wet, ugly sound of the dagger finding its mark again and again. The release of tension was immediate and absolute as the Baron's struggles ceased. He had done it, but the escape was where the true nature of his profession was revealed. He fled the castle, his heart still pounding his clothes, stained with more than just mud. He made his way to the prearranged rendezvous point, a crumbling shack in the woods. The second half of his payment, the only thought in his mind. But the client, the greasy little scribe who had hired him, was not there. Instead, 3 hulking thugs stepped out of the shadows, their own blades drawn. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The payment was never coming. A knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. This was the real climax of the job, the betrayal. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability, a loose end that needed to be tied off with something sharper than ink. Think that's the most brutal part of this story? If so, hit that like button, because you have no idea what's really coming. His survival instincts, honed not in a dojo, but in the desperate brawls of his past, took over. The fight was pure, ugly instinct. He threw a handful of dirt into the eyes of the first man, ducked under a wild swing from the second, and used his smaller frame to slam the third against a tree. It wasn't elegant. It was a chaotic scramble of kicking, biting, and gouging. He used the terrain, the darkness, and their overconfidence against them. He escaped, but not unscathed, a deep gash on his arm, and the few coins he had left, feeling as worthless as stones. He barely made it out of the woods, clutching the now useless purse, the promise of a new start, already curdled into the familiar taste of ash. He is now a ghost. The contract was a trap from the start, a political move designed to eliminate the Baron, and the tool used to do it in one fell swoop. His face, crudely sketched from the description of the panicked scullery maid, is now tacked to tavern doors and church walls. A week later, in a town 50 miles away, he huddles in a market, his hood pulled low. He watches 2 merchants animatedly discussing the Baron's shocking death, their voices a mix of fear and morbid excitement. He sees a city guard unfold a piece of parchment, his wanted poster, and his blood runs cold. He has to force himself to turn, to walk away at a normal pace, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. This is his new reality. Isolation and paranoia are no longer just conditions of the job. They are the very fabric of his existence. Every shadow could hold an enemy. Every friendly face could be a mask. He didn't just fail to be invisible. He failed to understand that in his world, perfection is the only metric for survival. He is only as good as his last kill, and while he succeeded in that, he failed the unwritten test that followed. He survived, and he wasn't supposed to. Failure in this line of work wasn't a bad performance review. It was a public, painful, and wildly theatrical death, often involving ropes fire or iron devices with creative names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant your target lived to tell everyone what you looked like. Failing to disappear after the kill meant your client would put out a second contract this time with your name on it. There were no second chances. No. Sorry, the blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. One shot, one moment. If you blew it, you ran. The man who was once a soldier, then a debtor, then an assassin, is now just a rumor, a whisper of a man who makes people disappear. But his own disappearance is the only job left, and it's one he must perform every single day for the rest of his short, haunted life. His silent, forgotten struggle is a testament to a brutal truth. True power rarely has to get its own hands dirty. While men like him were used as disposable blades and then erased from history, some architects of death never had to hide in the shadows. They ruled in plain sight, building empires and shaping destinies, not with a single whispered contract, but from a throne surrounded by the hiss of snakes and the weight of prophecy. The power that sent men like him to their doom belonged to a different and far more terrifying kind of predator one who wore a crown. The Serpent Queen's gambit, the making of an empress. While men like the assassin were used as disposable blades and then erased from history, some architects of death never had to hide in the shadows. They ruled in plain sight, building empires and shaping destinies, not with a single whispered contract, but from a throne surrounded by the hiss of snakes and the weight of prophecy. The power that sent nameless men to their doom belonged to a different and far more terrifying kind of predator one who wore a crown. Before she was the mother of an emperor, Olympias of Macedon was a princess from the wild lands of Epirus, a woman who slept with snakes and whispered to gods. And her enemies were right to be terrified. Her story does not begin in the polished marble courts of a sophisticated kingdom, but in the rugged, storm-swept mountains of Molossia, a place that felt older and wilder than the burgeoning power of Macedon to the east. Born Myrtle, this princess claimed descent from the mythical hero Achilles himself, and whether the blood of demigods truly ran in her veins or not, she carried herself with a primal intensity that set her apart from the carefully composed princesses of other realms. Her upbringing was not one of quiet embroidery and polite courtly manners. It was steeped in mystery ritual and the potent, often violent ecstasies of ancient mystery cults. She was particularly drawn to the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, the god of wine madness and religious ecstasy. Now let's be clear. These were not solemn, orderly processions. Imagine moonless nights deep in the Epirate forests, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Imagine the pounding, hypnotic rhythm of drums that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the world itself. This is where Myrtle found her power. She would join the other women, the Maenads, in a wild barefoot dance, their hair unbound, their movements driven not by choreography, but by a divine madness they called upon. They sought a direct personal union with the god, an experience so overwhelming it bordered on a complete loss of self. For many, this was terrifying. For Myrtle, it was home. She was not just a participant. She was an adept, a high priestess in this chaotic faith. She didn't merely pray to her gods. She felt she embodied them, channeling their ancient power. This connection manifested in ways that both enthralled and horrified those around her. Ancient sources, likely penned by men who viewed her with a cocktail of fascination and fear, speak of her keeping sacred snakes in her chambers. These were not mere pets. They were living conduits to the chthonic deities of the earth symbols of fertility, rebirth, and hidden wisdom creatures that bridged the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The accounts claim she would allow them to coil beside her as she slept, their cool scales a familiar presence in the dark. Whether this is literal fact or the kind of slander that has always clung to powerful, unconventional women, we will never truly know. But the story stuck, and it became a cornerstone of her identity. It's one of those historical details that makes you wonder, what do you think? Was she a genuine serpent priestess? Or was this just the most effective smear campaign in ancient history? Let me know your theory in the comments below. Fact or fiction, it worked. To her allies, it was a sign of her divine favor. To her enemies, it was proof of her dangerous, unnatural power. Her authority then was forged, not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in the uneasy flicker of torchlight among the whispers of priestesses and the sinuous curling bodies of serpents. She wasn't just another princess on the political marriage market. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. It was this potent mystery that ensnared Philip II of Macedon. In roughly 357 BCE, Philip, a man as brilliant as he was, brutal, as ambitious as he was famously licentious, traveled to the sacred island of Samothrace to be initiated into a religious mystery cult. There, he met Myrtle. He didn't just see a beautiful princess from a strategically important neighboring kingdom. He saw a challenge, a mystery he couldn't resist, a woman whose fiery intensity matched his own boundless ambition. Their union was not just a political alliance to secure Macedon's western flank. It was a collision of prophecy and power, a meeting of two apex predators who saw in each other a worthy partner and a formidable rival. From the very beginning, their marriage was shrouded in omens, and Olympias, a master of public relations, made sure everyone knew it. Legends likely encouraged and embellished by her claimed that lightning struck the sky on their wedding night. Later, she would profess to have dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb, seeding her with a child of divine origin. This wasn't just a fanciful dream, it was a political statement. It suggested her son was not merely the child of Philip, but the offspring of Zeus himself. Philip, for his part, reportedly had his own vision, that of sealing his wife's womb with the emblem of a lion. These stories became the founding mythology of their union, transforming a political marriage into a divinely ordained event. Whether they truly believed these visions or simply understood their political utility, they acted as if their offspring was destined to rule not just a kingdom, but the world. And when that child Alexander was born, Olympias intended to shape his destiny from his very first breath. Her arrival in the Macedonian court at Pella was the arrival of a foreign storm. Macedon wasn't the wild spiritual land of Epirus. It was a kingdom of iron and ambition, a place where political power was a bloody game of chess, where kings were routinely assassinated by their cousins and brothers, became rivals overnight. The Macedonian nobility was a proud, hard-drinking, and deeply patriarchal society. These were grizzled generals and landowners who valued battlefield prowess and blunt speech above all else. They viewed this Epirot princess with deep suspicion. Her foreign accent, her fervent and strange religious practices, and her proud, unyielding demeanor marked her as an outsider. But Olympias, who now adopted this new name to signify her new status, walked into this nest of vipers with her head held high, her eyes already fixed on the ultimate prize, ensuring her son's legacy. Their marriage, born of omens and ambition, was rocky from the start. Philip, for all his political and military genius, was not built for monogamy. He continued to collect wives like trophies, each marriage a calculated move to secure an alliance or consolidate power. For Philip, these were matters of state. For Olympias, they were personal and political threats. She wasn't a woman to sit quietly in the women's quarters while her husband took new brides. She held her own court, maintained her own political alliances, and was known to frequently turn to oracles and her private rituals to divine the future and perhaps to influence Philip's fate. At court feasts, while Philip caroused with his generals, she would sit silently, her dark eyes missing nothing, observing who flattered whom, who drank too much, and who harbored resentments. She saw each new wife not just as a romantic rival, but as a potential source of a rival heir who could threaten her son Alexander. The cracks in the royal marriage deepened with every new political union Philip made. But the final irreparable fracture came years later when Philip married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This marriage was different and far more dangerous. Unlike Philip's other wives, who were often foreign princesses, like Olympias Cleopatra, was a pure-blooded Macedonian, the niece of one of Philip's top generals, Attalus. This was more than a personal insult to Olympias. It was a direct political threat of the highest order. Any son born to Cleopatra Eurydice would be in the eyes of the proud Macedonian aristocracy more purely Macedonian than Alexander, whose mother was a foreigner from Epirus. This new marriage implicitly questioned Alexander's legitimacy and his claim to the throne. It was a soundbite that spread through the court like poison, the need for a pure air. Olympias saw the game clearly. The palace was no longer just a home. It was a battlefield for succession, and she would use every weapon at her disposal, every snake, every dream, every ritual, and every whispered insinuation to ensure that her son was not just remembered, but crowned. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the palace in Pella had become a cold war zone of veiled insults, political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Olympias was no longer just fighting for influence. She was fighting for her son's survival and her own. She knew the court was filled with snakes, but she was the one who had taught them how to bite. Philip then had begun to distance himself from her, spending more time on campaign drinking more heavily, and most dangerously, listening more to his Macedonian advisors who saw Olympias as a troublesome foreign influence. The marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice was the final blow. The wedding ceremony was a public and humiliating disaster for Olympias and Alexander. At the celebratory feast, Cleopatra's uncle, the general Attalus, drunkenly stood to offer a toast. Looking directly at Alexander, he urged the Macedonians to pray to the gods for a legitimate heir to the kingdom. The insult was unmistakable and twofold. It branded Alexander as a bastard and his mother as a foreign interloper. The implication that Alexander, the celebrated and brilliant heir, was somehow illegitimate sent a shockwave through the hall. You could have heard a pin drop before the outrage erupted. Alexander, enraged, reportedly, hurled his cup at Attalus and screamed, "Am I then a bastard?" Philip, drunk himself, drew his sword and lunged at his own son, only to trip and fall foolishly in a heap. It was a moment of supreme dysfunction, laying bare the toxic fractures within the royal family for all to see. Alexander stormed out of the feast, and soon after Olympias left Macedon entirely. She retreated to her homeland of Epirus, taking Alexander with her. But this was no defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal. In Epirus, she was not an outsider. She was royalty. She could gather support whisper in the ears of powerful allies and watch from a distance as Philip's court began to rot from within. She understood that she didn't need to be physically present in Pella to be dangerous. A well-placed rumor, a letter to a sympathetic noble, could be as effective as a dagger in the back. She was playing the long game, waiting for Philip to make a mistake. Then the world shook. In 336 BCE, Philip was at the height of his power, preparing to launch a massive invasion of the Persian Empire. At his daughter's wedding, a grand public spectacle designed to showcase his power and unity, he was assassinated. As he entered the theater, a jilted bodyguard named Pausanias rushed forward and stabbed him to death. The chaos was immediate. The question that echoed through every marble corridor and torchlit hall was the same: who was truly behind it. Was it simply the act of a disgruntled bodyguard? Was it the result of complex court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself, eager to take the throne? Or, as many whispered softly, was it Olympias? No one could ever prove it. No one dared to. But the timing was impossibly convenient, and her actions in the immediate aftermath were chillingly decisive. Within days of the assassination, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn infant, a daughter, were dead. The historical accounts are grim and vary in their details, but they agree on the outcome. Some say Olympias herself returned to the palace, strode into Cleopatra's chambers, and presented the terrified young queen with a choice of suicide weapons after having the infant daughter killed before her eyes. Others claim she had the child thrown onto a burning brazier. What is undisputed is that no mercy was shown. The rival bloodline was extinguished with a brutal finality that was her signature. Was this a mother's righteous fury or a cold-blooded political calculation? Smash that subscribe button. And let's keep digging into these dark corners of history, because stories like this are exactly what we do here. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing and no one stood between her son and the throne of Macedon. With Philip dead and Macedon in a state of mourning and confusion, Olympias made her move. While other powerful figures scrambled to understand the chaos, she acted with swift, brutal, and terrifying decisiveness. She understood what many in ancient courts refused to accept in a royal palace mercy is a liability. A rival claimant, no matter how small, is a future war. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra Eurydice and her bloodline erased from existence, the path was clear. Her teenage son, Alexander, already a charismatic and battle-tested commander, trained by Aristotle himself, was declared king. While there was some brief opposition, it was quickly crushed. But make no mistake, it wasn't just Alexander's charisma or his father's legacy that secured his seamless ascension. It was the terrifying efficiency of his mother working in the background. Olympias knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which remaining enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting her son's rise to power. She was engineering it, clearing his path with a ruthless precision that left the court both awed and terrified. Alexander himself did not always approve of her methods. He reportedly expressed his disapproval of the brutal violence against Cleopatra's family. But he also did not stop it. For deep down, he knew what Olympias had always known: power demands blood. And in the cutthroat world of the Macedonian court, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse to be managed. With her son, now king of Macedon, Olympias began to recede slightly from the public eye. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted her tactics from the open, brutal strikes of a coup to the whispered, venomous influence of a queen mother. As Alexander prepared to launch his father's grand ambition, the conquest of the Persian Empire, she remained behind in Pella. She was not a passive, doting mother waiting for letters. She was the spiritual guardian of his destiny and a formidable political player in her own right. She sent him sacred relics for protection, consulted oracles on his behalf, and performed the ancient rituals she believed would ensure his success. In her mind, her son's mission wasn't just a military campaign, it was a divine destiny. Alexander wasn't just going to war, he was fulfilling prophecy. However, a new and powerful rival emerged to challenge her authority at home: Antipater, one of Philip's most trusted and experienced generals, whom Alexander had left behind as regent of Macedon. The old soldier had no love for the foreign queen and her mystical ways. A clash was inevitable. Olympias, watching from the palace, began to spin a new web. She started sending a constant stream of letters to her son on the front lines thousands of miles away. These letters were not the sweet nothings of a loving mother. They were sharp, calculated political briefings, laced with venom and prophecy. A hypothetical excerpt might read, "My dearest Alexander, while you win glory in the East, do not forget the vipers in our own court. Antipater grows too bold. He sits on your father's council and wears your authority like a cloak. But his heart is full of ambition. The omens are dark. The serpents are restless. Remember, a throne is easier to lose at home than it is to win abroad. Trust no one but the gods and your mother." She was now fighting a new war, a war of correspondence and political intrigue, realizing that her fight for power was far from over. It had just entered a new, deadlier phase, a shadow war for control of the heart of an empire, even as her son conquered the known world. The palace of Macedon was a labyrinth of intrigue, but thousands of years earlier, on an island in the Aegean, a real labyrinth was built, a place that housed a secret far more monstrous, or so the legends would have us believe. The labyrinth of a lost world inside the myth of Knossos. The palace of Macedon was a labyrinth of intrigue, a maze of whispers and veiled threats. But thousands of years earlier, on a sun-bleached island in the Aegean, a real labyrinth was built, or so the legends would have us believe. This was a place that housed a secret far more monstrous, a structure born not of political cunning, but of an alien and unsettling genius. On the island of Crete, just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that defies logic. It is the Palace of Knossos. To walk its grounds is to step into an architectural riddle. On one hand, you see evidence of a civilization so advanced it is staggering multi-story apartments, brilliant light wells that illuminated inner chambers, and an intricate system of clay pipes that provided running water and flushing toilets millennia before the Romans made such things famous. Yet for all its sophistication, this sprawling complex of over 1,000 rooms, covering nearly 150,000 square feet, possessed no massive defensive walls. In an age of brutal endemic warfare, this peaceful confidence is perhaps the most shocking feature of all. Stone corridors snake in all directions, rooms twist and double back on themselves, and staircases lead to unexpected levels or end in shadows. It's easy to lose your sense of direction even today. The ancient Greeks, looking back at this magnificent, confusing ruin, believed it housed a monster, the Minotaur. They were wrong. The palace was the monster. This was the heart of the Minoan civilization, one of Europe's earliest and most enigmatic societies. Flourishing from around 2600 to 1400 BCE, the Minoans were not like the warrior cultures that would follow them. They were not the Spartans who sharpened spears, nor the Mycenaeans who built Cyclopean fortresses. Their artwork, vibrant and fluid, does not celebrate conquest or glorify kings. Instead, it celebrates life. Leaping dolphins swim across plaster walls, elegant women with bare chests and flounced skirts perform sacred rituals, and young athletes, both male and female, vault gracefully over the backs of charging bulls. This was a civilization that ruled not through conquest, but through trade. Their ships, sleek and silent, cut through the Mediterranean, carrying pottery, saffron, and luxury goods to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the distant shores of the Levant. They built relationships, not vast armies, and this more than weapons made them powerful and rich. Their power was projected not by soldiers, but by the sheer quality and desirability of their goods and culture. At the center of it all stood Knossos, a place that was less a fortress and more an entire city under one roof. It was a hub of culture, religion, and economy, a masterpiece of organized chaos. The palace wasn't built all at once, but grew organically over centuries, with wings and levels added as needed, which only contributed to its bewildering layout. To an ancient visitor, it must have felt like magic. To modern archaeologists, it remains a beautiful, bewildering puzzle. And for centuries, this puzzle lay buried, its story told, only through the distorted lens of Greek myth. That is until one man decided to chase that myth. In the early 1900s, a British archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans arrived on Crete. Evans was a man with a flair for the dramatic, a deep love for the Homeric epics, and a pocket full of money. He wasn't just an academic. He was an adventurer from a wealthy family, driven by an obsessive conviction that the legends of ancient Greece were not mere stories, but fossilized memories of a real heroic age. He was convinced that the myths of King Minos and his monstrous stepson, the Minotaur, were echoes of a historical truth. Local farmers had been unearthing strange carved seals near a mound of earth known as Kephala, and Evans, sensing something enormous lay beneath, purchased the land and began to dig. What he found would change the history of the Aegean forever. The tension of his excavation must have been immense. With each spadeful of earth, a lost world emerged. He was not just uncovering a building. He was uncovering a civilization so advanced that it defied all expectations. He found the storerooms with their giant pithoi jars, some as tall as a man, capable of holding thousands of gallons of olive oil, a sign of immense wealth and centralized control. He uncovered the throne room with its striking, high-backed alabaster chair, the oldest throne in Europe, flanked by frescoes of griffins, mythical beasts that seemed to guard a long-dead king or priestess. Imagine the feeling of that discovery clearing away the dirt to reveal a seat of power that had not been seen for over 3,000 years. He found the vibrant frescoes, their colors of ochre blue and crimson, still shockingly bright. And everywhere he looked, he found the bull. Bulls painted on walls, bulls carved into stone-stylized bullhorns, on rooftops and altars, and the now famous fresco of young acrobats somersaulting over a charging bull's back. Can you even imagine the courage that would take? It's a real-life extreme sport, but with life-or-death stakes. Smash that like button if you think that's insane. For Evans, this obsession was clear, and it all pointed in one direction: the Minotaur. Yet, as the excavation continued, a strange tension must have built within him. He was unearthing a palace of unparalleled sophistication, a home to a seemingly peaceful and artistic people. But he could not find the labyrinth. There was no underground maze, no prison chamber built by Daedalus. The deeper he dug, the more he must have realized the truth. The palace itself, with its disorienting layout, its nested rooms and winding corridors, was the labyrinth. It wasn't designed to hold a monster. Its very design was monstrously complex, a deliberate and awe-inspiring piece of architectural psychology intended to impress and perhaps intimidate visitors. And then he found the most tantalizing mystery of all their writing. The Minoans had a script, a beautiful flowing system of symbols, known today as Linear A. It was everywhere on clay tablets, on seals on pottery. And it was completely unreadable. It remains undeciphered to this day. Imagine the frustration for Evans. Here was the voice of a lost civilization, a key that could unlock the secrets of their beliefs, their history, their name for themselves. And it was silent. The tablets recorded inventories, so much grain, so many jars of oil. But the language itself, the grammar, the stories remained a locked box. What secrets are locked away in this elegant script? What prayers did they speak? What histories did they write? We can only guess. This undeciphered script is the ultimate curiosity, a locked door in the heart of the labyrinth. This brings us to the climax of Arthur Evans's own story, and the most controversial chapter in the history of Knossos. Faced with the crumbling ruins exposed to the elements after millennia underground, and driven by his singular vision, Evans made a decision that has been debated by archaeologists ever since. He decided not just to excavate, but to reconstruct. Using reinforced concrete, a material of his own age, he rebuilt sections of the palace as he imagined they once stood. He raised the iconic red, downward tapering columns, replastered the walls, and had artists recreate the frescoes from the fallen fragments. His goal was to make the ruins intelligible, to give visitors a sense of the palace's original grandeur. It is without a doubt a breathtaking act of imagination. But it is also an act that forever blurred the line between history and fantasy. What visitors see today at Knossos is part ancient ruin, part Edwardian vision. Some call it an act of visionary preservation that brought the site to life for millions. Others call it an act of archaeological vandalism that imposed a modern interpretation onto an ancient mystery. It's a huge debate even today. What do you think? Was he a hero for saving Knossos, or did he ruin it? Let me know your take in the comments below. In a way, the climax of Evans's story is that the archaeologist became a creator, a modern Daedalus, building upon the ruins of the old, ensuring that the labyrinth would forever be tangled with his own imagination. He didn't just resurrect a palace. He resurrected a myth and forced historians to reckon with the fact that behind the legend was something real, something complex, and something profoundly human. So if there was no literal Minotaur, where did the story come from? The answer likely lies in the relationship between the Minoans and the later, more warlike civilizations of mainland Greece like the Mycenaeans. To a visiting Greek from 1000 BCE, the Minoan civilization would have seemed both elegant and alien. Their palaces were unwalled and open, while the Mycenaeans hid behind massive cyclopean fortresses. Minoan art was fluid and natural, while Mycenaean art was rigid and focused on war and hunting. The Minoans worshipped powerful goddesses, like the famous snake goddess figurines discovered at Knossos, and seemed to have a reverence for the natural world that was profoundly different from the patriarchal sky god-dominated pantheon of the later Greeks. The myth of the Minotaur then can be read as a piece of political propaganda, a memory of a time when Crete was the dominant power in the Aegean. The story goes that King Minos of Crete demanded a tribute from Athens, 7 youths and 7 maidens sent each year to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. What if this wasn't a literal sacrifice to a beast? What if it was a metaphor for the political and economic subjugation of the mainland Greeks? The labyrinth could symbolize the inescapable trap of Minoan political dominance, a web of trade and naval power, from which weaker states could not break free. The Minotaur itself, a creature that was half man, half bull, could represent the raw, terrifying, and somewhat inhuman force of Minoan rule, as seen through the eyes of their rivals. It was a way for the later Greeks to explain and demonize a power that had once overshadowed them. But the final and greatest mystery of Knossos is not its architecture or its myths, but its end. For centuries, this beacon of prosperity and cultural sophistication stood at the heart of the Aegean world. And then around 1400 BCE, it all stopped. The palace was abandoned. The vibrant frescoes were left to fade, and the great Minoan civilization that once ruled the seas vanished like mist. What happened? The ruins themselves are eerily silent on this matter. Unlike many ancient cities, there are no widespread layers of ash and rubble indicating a final catastrophic battle. Knossos didn't seem to fall with a scream. It fell with a whisper. This has led to several competing theories, each a compelling mystery in its own right. The first and most dramatic is the cataclysmic eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, about 70 miles to the north. Around 1600 BCE, Thera exploded in one of the largest volcanic events in human history, an eruption so massive it dwarfed Krakatoa. The blast would have been apocalyptic. It would have triggered colossal tsunamis, some perhaps hundreds of feet high, that would have battered the northern coast of Crete, obliterating its ports and its powerful navy in a single blow. The sky would have darkened for days as volcanic ash rained down, choking crops, poisoning livestock, and disrupting the climate, leading to years of famine. While Knossos itself wasn't immediately destroyed, the economic, political, and spiritual foundations of the civilization may have been irrevocably shaken. A power based on sea trade is nothing without its fleet and its ability to feed its people. Another theory points to a more human culprit invasion. By around 1450 BCE, the rising power of the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece was undeniable. It's possible that they took advantage of a weakened Minoan state, whether post-eruption or due to other factors. The archaeological evidence is suggestive. After this date, the culture at Knossos changes. The art becomes more rigid and martial. And most importantly, the undeciphered Linear A script is replaced by Linear B, an early form of Greek, the language of the Mycenaeans. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and bull dancers now whispered in a foreign tongue. This suggests a new administration, a new ruling class. Perhaps it wasn't a single bloody conquest, but a gradual absorption first through trade, then influence, and finally rule as a new warrior elite took over the sophisticated bureaucracy of the old regime. A third possibility is that the enemy came from within. Perhaps the sophisticated and complex palatial system, with its centralized economy, simply collapsed under its own weight. A civil uprising born of social inequality, a devastating plague that swept through the dense population, a prolonged drought, or a political schism that fractured the ruling elite could have brought the system to a grinding halt, leaving it vulnerable to outside forces, or simply unable to continue. What is so haunting is that the ruins offer no clear answer. They leave us with only questions and the faint echo of a lost world humming in the maze. The Minoans felt so secure in their island home that they built palaces, not fortresses. History would show this to be a fatal luxury, as other civilizations across the world dedicated their greatest minds and vastest resources to precisely the opposite problem, the brutal, bloody, and ingenious art of turning walls to dust. A symphony of destruction, the art of tearing down walls. The Minoans felt so secure in their island home that they built palaces, not fortresses. History would show this to be a fatal luxury, as other civilizations across the world dedicated their greatest minds and vastest resources to precisely the opposite problem, the brutal, bloody, and ingenious art of turning walls to dust. To an ancient city, it was the sound of the apocalypse, a rhythmic, earth-shaking thump. 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 It was the sound of a battering ram, and it meant your world was about to end. Place yourself on the stone battlements of a besieged city. For weeks, you have watched the enemy army assemble a sprawling camp of tents and cookfires that has choked the life from the surrounding countryside. And now, the first great beast of war is rolling forward. At its simplest, it was just a massive tree trunk carried by a team of frenzied soldiers who would smash it against your gates with more hope than strategy. But the machine creaking towards you now is an evolved predator. It's a massive log, sometimes tipped with iron, suspended by chains within a heavy-wheeled frame. A roof of wet animal hides protects its crew from your arrows and stones. Its name in Latin is Ares the Ram, and it has come to knock on your door, and it will not stop until the door is splinters. The relief you first felt at its slow approach curdles into dread as it reaches the gate. The first impact is a jarring shock, a deep thud that you feel in your teeth. Then comes the second, and the third. It becomes a relentless heartbeat of destruction, a sound designed to break your spirit long before it breaks the wood. Each thump is a promise from the outside world, we are coming in. Operating this beast was a symphony of sweat and teamwork. Dozens of men had to work in perfect, exhausting sync, swinging the massive beam while under constant threat. And it wasn't just the front door they were smashing. Rams were used to test the entire perimeter, striking at points in the wall deemed weaker by enemy engineers, seeking to collapse watchtowers or shatter the foundations of the gatehouse itself. The presence of a battering ram was a declaration. It said, "Surrender now, or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread." But as a defender, you were not helpless. While the ram's crew toiled below, you would unleash your own fury from above. It took a grim sort of courage to lean out over the battlements, exposing yourself to enemy archers, to tip a cauldron of boiling oil. You wouldn't just hear the screams, you would smell the grotesque result. Oil was especially feared. Unlike water, it clung to skin and clothing soaking into armor, before being ignited by a fire arrow turning a soldier into a screaming torch. Hot sand, though less dramatic, was vicious in its own right, slipping into the gaps of a man's armor to cook the flesh beneath. And gravity itself became a weapon. Giant stones and heavy logs were dropped from the parapets, aimed not just at the crew, but at the machine itself, hoping to splinter the frame or break the swinging beam. Siege warfare was a game of attrition, a brutal exchange of physics and pain. If the battering ram was the brute, the catapult was the tactician. Where the ram smashed, the catapult thought. It attacked from a distance, launching not just stones, but psychological dread. These were the first true artillery pieces in history, and they revolutionized warfare by turning physics into a weapon that felt almost like black magic. Emerging from the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, early catapults were masterpieces of tension. Engineers like those commissioned by the tyrant Dionysius the Pharos of Syracuse figured out that by twisting massive bundles of rope, often made from animal sinew or human hair, they could store enormous amounts of potential energy. When released, this force could hurl stones, javelins, or flaming projectiles hundreds of meters with terrifying accuracy. From your position on the wall, the first sign of this new threat would be a distant thwack, followed by the whistle of something heavy cutting through the air. A 60-pound stone crashes into the battlements, near you shattering stone and confidence alike. The Roman engineers, who never met a Greek idea they couldn't improve and mass-produce, perfected these machines. They built the ballista, which looked like a giant crossbow, and fired massive bolts capable of impaling multiple soldiers at once, and the stone-throwing onager, which could be broken down, packed onto carts, and reassembled on site by legions on the march. But the true terror of the catapult wasn't just its destructive power, it was its versatility in spreading fear. Ancient commanders knew that the mind was a battlefield just as important as the walls. Soon, the payloads flying over your head were no longer just stones. Imagine the horror of seeing a familiar face, perhaps that of a messenger or a captured commander sent to negotiate, launched over the walls, his severed head tumbling through the air to land in the middle of the courtyard. It was a message there are no negotiations. Then came the biological warfare. The enemy would begin launching the diseased corpses of animals, or even their own plague-ridden dead over the walls. The goal was simple and sickening: to spread disease, panic, and despair within the besieged city, turning your home into a festering trap. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it's believed that this very tactic, hurling plague-infected corpses over the city walls, helped trigger one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, the Black Death in Europe. It's a brutal thought, but if you're finding this deep dive into the dark ingenuity of history fascinating, make sure you're subscribed because it only gets more intense from here. Which do you think would break your will first? The constant bombardment of stones or the terror of what might come next? Let me know in the comments. As terrifying as the projectiles were, the defenders had their own legendary countermeasure, a weapon so secret and so horrifying that its formula has been lost to time: Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantine Empire around the 7th century CE, this was a mysterious napalm-like substance that could be sprayed from siphons, mounted on ships, or hurled in clay pots. It was a liquid that stuck to woodstone and flesh, and most terrifyingly, it could not be put out with water. In fact, water often seemed to make it burn even more fiercely. Imagine being a sailor on an attacking ship watching as a Byzantine vessel unleashes a torrent of this liquid fire. It turns your ship into a floating inferno from which there is no escape. To an enemy, it must have seemed like a violation of the laws of nature, a sign that the defenders had harnessed hellfire itself. The mystery of its composition, likely a mixture of petroleum sulfur and other chemicals, was one of the most closely guarded state secrets in history, and it died with the empire. While the catapults and rams focused on breaking the walls, the siege towers took a more personal approach. They were wooden skyscrapers on wheels, sometimes rising 9 stories high, covered in wet hides to prevent fire and bristling with archers. Their purpose was simple: to roll right up to your wall and deliver armed invaders directly onto the battlements. The sight of one of these monstrosities, like the infamous Heliopolis or Taker of Cities, built by Demetrius during the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, was an exercise in pure intimidation. Rising over 100 feet tall, plated in iron, and equipped with its own batteries of catapults, it was moved by the combined strength of thousands of soldiers. It was less a weapon and more a mobile mountain of death. The ambition was so immense that it actually broke under its own weight, but the statement had been made. You weren't just being attacked anymore. You were being personally visited by a mobile fortress. Archers on its upper decks would rain death down upon you, clearing the battlements, while troops on the lower levels prepared to board. The moment its gangplank dropped onto your wall, the fight for the city became a desperate hand-to-hand struggle for survival. Yet even as this symphony of destruction played out in the open, the most insidious threat was often the one you couldn't see or hear. It was the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare siege, tunneling or sapping. The idea was ancient and horrifyingly effective. While the chaos raged above, a team of enemy miners would be silently digging a tunnel beneath your feet. Their target, the very foundations of your walls. Once they were underneath, they would prop up the tunnel's ceiling with heavy wooden timbers, pack the space with flammable materials like pig fat and pitch, and then set it on fire. The fat was crucial. It ensured an intense, sustained heat that would utterly consume the wooden supports. As the supports burned away, the tunnel would collapse, and the massive stone wall above it, its foundation gone, would crumble into a heap of rubble. Imagine standing watch on a quiet night, the distant sounds of the enemy camp, a familiar hum. Suddenly you feel a deep, unsettling vibration through the soles of your feet. You hear a low groan, like the earth itself is in pain. And then a 50-foot section of the wall you are standing on simply gives way, plunging downwards into a cloud of dust and chaos. The silence that follows is more terrifying than any battle cry, because it is the sound of a perfect, undeniable breach. In some sieges, defenders would become so paranoid about this silent threat that they would place bowls of water along the base of the wall, watching for the telltale ripples that would betray the vibrations of digging below. This often led to the eerie, claustrophobic horror of countermining, as defenders would dig their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. Imagine the terror of that work, digging in the pitch black, the air thick with dust, listening for the faint tap-tap-tapping of an enemy pick. The moment you break through combat is instant and savage, a desperate fight with shovels and knives in a space no larger than a coffin. But the true king of siege warfare, the weapon that combined brute force range and psychological terror into one majestic and horrifying package, was the trebuchet. Unlike the tension-powered catapult, the trebuchet was a master of gravity. It was a simple principle scaled up to a monstrous size, a long swinging arm on a massive frame with a huge counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Watching one being assembled just out of arrow range was a spectacle of impending doom. It took hours, sometimes days, to build. It wasn't a weapon, it was an engineering project of pure malice. The process of firing it was a slow, deliberate ritual of terror. You would hear the groaning of winches and the grinding of ropes as dozens of men slowly raised the counterweight, which could weigh many tons. Then an agonizing silence would fall over the battlefield, a shared moment of held breath between attacker and defender. With a sudden crash, the weight would be released. The arm would whip around with incredible speed, and the sling would fling its deadly payload in a high, graceful arc. You could watch it coming. A 300-pound stone, the size of a small cow, sailing through the sky, seeming to hang there for an eternity before crashing into one of your towers with enough force to turn stone to dust. The trebuchet wasn't a weapon of war, it was a statement of inevitability. But it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets hurled everything diseased animals to spread plague pots of burning pitch to start fires deep inside the city. The severed heads of captured soldiers, and even beehives to unleash swarms upon the defenders. One legendary account from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of a trebuchet called Warwolf, a machine so massive and so terrifying that the defenders surrendered before it was even fired. King Edward VI, however, refused to accept their surrender, allegedly stating, "You don't deserve any grace, but you are to return to your castle, and I will see my trebuchet." He had built his toy, and he was determined to see it used. The first shot from Warwolf was said to have leveled an entire section of the castle wall, a demonstration of overwhelming power, meant to crush not just fortifications, but all hope. The climax of a siege, then, was not a single glorious battle. It was the slow, grinding despair of the defenders. It was the realization that your walls, the very symbol of your safety and civilization, were temporary. It was the moment a section of that wall crumbled from a mine you never saw, revealing a gaping wound in your city's defenses. It was the dust clearing to reveal the first wave of attackers, a flood of steel and fury already clambering over the rubble. The story of siege warfare ends here, not with the triumph of the victor, but with the chilling realization that for every great wall humanity has ever built, it has dedicated even more ingenuity to forging a more terrible way to destroy it. This was a legacy of destruction that would only be amplified a symphony of chaos that was about to get a new explosive instrument. The echo in the ruins, the dust settled on the broken stones, but the ideas born from the siege never vanished. They live on a legacy of destruction that would only be amplified a symphony of chaos that was about to get a new explosive instrument. From the intimate brutality of a single dagger to the impersonal earth-shattering power of a trebuchet, the story of conflict is one of relentless escalation. But what does it mean when we look back at these moments, stripping away the myths of glory and heroism? What truth is left standing when the romanticized sheen of history flakes away? What remains is a core of human desperation, ambition, and a terrifyingly creative brutality. The stories we've walked through of the killer, the queen, the labyrinth, and the siege are not separate tales. They are facets of a single uncomfortable truth that the history we think we know is often a carefully constructed narrative designed to be more palatable than the grim reality. The real stories are messier, more complex, and infinitely more compelling. We began with the assassin, the hooded figure of legend. But he wasn't a master of a deadly art gliding through shadows with preternatural grace. He was a symptom of a broken society. He was the desperation of a starving peasant, the despair of a disgraced soldier, a disposable tool for the powerful. His story is not one of a clandestine brotherhood, but of profound, crushing loneliness. He was a footnote in a nobleman's ledger, A man whose life was worth less than the promise of a few coins, a ghost whose only legacy was to be erased. The myth of the cool, calculating killer is a lie. The truth is, a man trembling in a haystack. His only ally, a rusty blade, his only future, a betrayal he never saw coming. His unglamorous life reveals the true foundation of so many great historical movements, the exploitation of the desperate. From the man who had no power, we turn to a woman who coveted it all. Olympias, the Serpent Queen, was not just a monster from a Greek tragedy. She was a master of a political game that had no rules. In a world dominated by warrior kings, she wielded different weapons: prophecy, religious fervor, and a ruthless understanding of political calculus. Where the assassin was a tool to be discarded, the queen was the hand that wielded the tools, clearing a path for her son with poison intrigue and the chillingly efficient removal of any rival, no matter how small. Her story reminds us that power is not always won on the battlefield. Sometimes it is secured in the dark corridors of a palace through whispered rumors and decisive, brutal acts that history would later brand as monstrous. She shows us the true cost of building an empire, a price paid in blood and secrets. From the labyrinth of the Macedonian court, we journeyed to the heart of an even older mystery, the Palace of Knossos on Crete. The later Greeks, with their worldview of heroes and monsters, looked upon the bewildering ruins of this alien civilization and had to invent a beast, the Minotaur, to live at its center. But the labyrinth wasn't a prison for a monster. It was the shadow of a civilization too strange to be understood. The Minoans, with their peaceful artistic culture, their unwalled palaces, and their worship of nature, were so fundamentally different from the warrior societies that succeeded them that they became an enigma. The myth of the Minotaur is more revealing of its creators than its subject. It shows how we often create monsters to explain what we fear or cannot comprehend. The true mystery of Knossos is not a beast, but a whisper, the silence of a sophisticated society that vanished, leaving behind only its beautiful, unsettling art and a language we cannot read. And finally, we stood on the battlements of a besieged city and witnessed the height of human creativity applied to destruction. The story of siege warfare is the story of a terrifying intellectual arms race. It wasn't just a battle of strength. It was a battle of engineering psychology and relentless ingenuity. For every defensive wall built a more ingenious engine was designed to tear it down. The battering ram, the catapult, the siege tower, the trebuchet, each was a leap forward in the science of demolition. This brutal symphony of destruction shows us the frightening duality of the human mind. The same creativity that can build a palace with flushing toilets can also design a machine to hurl diseased corpses over its walls. It is a stark reminder that progress is not inherently moral. It is simply a sharper tool to be used for good or for ill. These unglamorous realities, stripped of their heroic myths, are far more compelling than the simple stories we are often told. They are compelling because they are real. They show us the true cost of power, the profound fragility of civilization, and the relentless, often terrifying nature of human survival and ambition. The forgotten assassin, the ruthless queen, the lost civilization, the broken wall. These are not just historical curiosities. They are mirrors. The stories are over. The people are dust. Their walls have crumbled and their empires are gone. But the patterns repeat. The desire for power, the fear of the unknown, the use of deception, and the grim willingness to do whatever it takes to survive these are not artifacts buried in the past. They are part of the human condition. They echo in our own world, in our own politics, in our own societies. The shadows of the past are long, and if you look closely, you can see them reaching all the way to the present. The only question is whether we are willing to see the truths they hold.